At a lonely gas station in the middle of winter, a former Navy SEAL lives like he no longer matters. Cars stop, fill up, and leave, and no one even remembers his face. Then one morning, a small object appears at his door, carefully placed like it was meant for him. The next day, another one shows up, and then another, always the same quiet, deliberate act. Out in the cold, a stray dog watches from a distance, never coming close, never asking for anything. For the first time in years, he stops ignoring it and starts waiting for something to come back. Where are you watching from, and what did this story make you feel? Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 and keep these stories alive. By midwinter, the gas station felt less like a destination and more like a pause the world barely acknowledged. Snow stretched in every direction, flattening the land into something quiet and indifferent. The highway cut through it like a long gray scar, vehicles appearing only as distant murmurs before flashing past in streaks of light and wind. Most didn't stop. The few that did stayed just long enough to fill their tanks, warm their hands, and disappear again. The station itself stood stubbornly against the cold, a low building with a flickering overhead sign, half of its letters burned out. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the pumps and the small concrete platform in front of the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old coffee and motor oil. Ethan Cross moved through it all like someone who had been there longer than he should have, but not long enough to belong. He checked the pumps without being told, wiped down the glass doors when the frost crept in, fixed loose hinges, rewired faulty switches, tightened bolts no one else noticed were coming undone. It wasn't a job that required much thinking. That was part of why he had taken it. No one gave him instructions beyond the basics. No one checked his work. As long as the lights stayed on and the fuel kept flowing, that was enough. Most days, no one spoke to him unless they needed something. Even then, it wasn't really to him. Pump 3's slow. Restroom locked? Got any change? They never asked his name, and after a while, he stopped offering it. Martha Cole owned the place, though she rarely stayed inside for long. She was in her late 60s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair tied into a loose knot that never quite held. Her movements carried the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing the same work for decades, and had long ago stopped expecting it to be anything else. She wore thick wool coats layered over practical clothes, her boots leaving small patches of melted snow wherever she stepped. "You're early," she said one morning without looking up from the ledger in her hands. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. He hadn't noticed the time. Didn't have anything else to do. She gave a small hum, not quite agreement, not quite judgment. "That'll do it," she said. That was as close as she came to conversation most days. Still, she noticed things, like how Ethan stayed outside longer than necessary, how he lingered near the edge of the light when the sun went down, how he watched the highway even when nothing was coming. She never asked why. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped again. The wind shifted, carrying fine snow across the ground in restless patterns. It gathered in the corners of the building, against the base of the pumps, along the shallow steps leading up to the door. Ethan stepped outside with a rag in his hand, wiping down the metal surface of Pump 4. The cold bit through the fabric of his gloves, slow and deliberate. The world felt distant out here. Sound didn't travel the same way. It seemed to sink into the snow before it could go anywhere. He worked in silence, finishing the last of his routine without rushing. There was no reason to rush. Nothing was waiting. The sky darkened early. By the time the overhead lights flickered on, the station stood alone in a wide circle of artificial brightness, surrounded by shadow and drifting white. Ethan leaned against the side of the building, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The black field jacket had seen better years, edges worn, fabric faded in places, but it held the cold well enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old metal lighter. It rested in his palm, heavier than it looked. He turned it once, then again. A habit, nothing more. The metal clicked softly as it rotated between his fingers, catching what little light there was. For a moment, he watched the reflection shift across its scratched surface. Then something moved. Not in the obvious way, no sudden motion, no clear shape. Just a break in the stillness. Ethan's hand stilled. He lifted his gaze toward the edge of the light, where the snow faded into darkness. There, low to the ground, barely visible. At first, it could have been anything. A drift of snow shifting in the wind, a shadow caught at the wrong angle. But then it moved again. Careful, measured. Not the erratic motion of something panicked, not the smooth glide of something at ease, something in between. Ethan pushed himself off the wall, his boots crunching lightly against the frozen ground as he took a step forward. The shape remained at the edge of the light, still not fully revealed, watching. He stopped. There was no instinct to call out, no reason to approach further. Out here, things didn't come closer unless they meant to. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The wind shifted again, brushing snow across the ground in a thin, restless line. Then the shape stepped just far enough forward for the light to catch it. A dog. German shepherd, or something close enough. Black along the back, darker than the surrounding night, with muted brown along the legs and chest that looked faded under the cold. Too thin. Not starving, but not far from it. One ear stood upright, the other tilted slightly at the tip as if it had never fully decided which way to go. Its head was lowered just enough to suggest caution, not submission, and its eyes, what little he could see of them, didn't flicker the way a stray's usually did. They held, not aggressive, not fearful, just steady. Ethan didn't move any closer. The dog didn't retreat. The distance between them stayed exactly the same, as if both had agreed to it without saying anything. He could feel the cold more sharply now, creeping in through the seams of his gloves, pressing against his fingers. Still, he didn't break the moment. He had seen animals before, plenty of them. Most either ran or approached. This one did neither. It stood there just inside the edge of the light, like it had chosen that exact spot for a reason. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying it. Not lost, he murmured under his breath. It didn't react, didn't shift its weight, didn't step forward. For a second, just a second, he had the faint, unreasonable sense that it was waiting. Not for food, not for movement, for something else. Then the wind picked up again, sharper this time. Snow brushed across the ground in a low, sweeping motion, breaking the stillness. And just like that, the dog stepped back. One step, then another. No rush, no panic. It turned slightly, its body angling away from the light. Then it was gone, not running, not disappearing suddenly, just no longer there. Ethan stood where he was for a while after, long enough for the cold to settle deeper into his bones, long enough for the space where the dog had been to feel different. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the air before it faded. Then he turned and went back inside. The rest of the night passed the same way it always did. A truck stopped briefly. Driver tired, quiet, paid in cash. A couple passing through asked for directions, barely listening to the answer before heading back out. The clock ticked forward without urgency. Ethan locked the door a few minutes before closing, flipping the sign to indicate the station was done for the night. He moved through the small building one last time, checking lights, making sure everything was in order. Nothing had changed. That was the point. Morning came without ceremony. A pale light spread slowly across the snow, softening the edges of everything it touched. Ethan stepped out the front door, the cold hitting sharper than the night before. He paused at the top of the small concrete steps, adjusting the collar of his jacket. Then he saw it. Right there. At the bottom step. A single object, half dusted with snow. He didn't move at first, just looked at it. It didn't belong there. That was clear immediately. Too deliberate, too centered, placed, not dropped. Ethan stepped down slowly, his boots pressing into the thin layer of frost. He crouched, brushing the snow aside with the back of his glove. A glove, old, worn, the fabric darkened by moisture and time, one of a pair most likely, the other missing. It wasn't anything valuable, not useful, not even particularly clean. Still, it had been set there carefully, not tossed, not left behind, placed. Ethan picked it up, turning it slightly in his hand. The fabric was stiff from the cold, the seams frayed in places. He glanced out toward the highway. Nothing. Toward the edge of the light, only snow. The wind moved lightly across the ground, erasing small traces as it went. No clear tracks remained, no sign of where it had come from. Ethan stood there a moment longer, the glove resting in his palm. Then, without really thinking about it, he turned and carried it inside. He set it down on the counter near the register, not in the trash. Not out of the way, just there. He didn't say anything about it when Martha arrived later that morning, but she saw it. She always did. Her gaze lingered on the glove for a second longer than necessary as she set her things down. "You expecting someone?" she asked casually. Ethan shook his head. "No." She nodded once, not pressing. "Things show up out here," she said after a moment. "Sometimes with no reason at all." Ethan glanced at the glove again. Something about that didn't sit right, not because it was strange, but because it didn't feel random. He didn't argue, just gave a small nod and went back to work. Outside, the highway kept moving. Cars passed, trucks slowed, then continued on. The world carried forward, indifferent as ever. But every now and then, without meaning to, Ethan found himself looking toward the edge of the light again, as if something there might be waiting. The glove stayed where Ethan had left it, not hidden, not examined too closely, just resting near the edge of the counter, within reach but not part of anything. By midday, it had already become something the room adjusted around, like a chair slightly out of place that no one bothered to move. Ethan didn't touch it again. Not because it didn't matter, but because touching it again might mean deciding what it was, and he wasn't ready for that. The morning passed the way most mornings did. A delivery truck came and went, the driver barely stepping inside. A sedan pulled in, engine running the entire time as if stopping was already more than they intended. Ethan worked through his routine with the same measured movements: wipe, check, adjust, tighten. But there was a difference now, not in what he did, in where his attention went when he wasn't doing it. The door, the edge of the steps, the space just beyond the reach of the overhead light. He didn't linger there, not openly, but his eyes returned to it more often than before. It was later in the afternoon when he saw it. At first, it looked like nothing. A dark patch against the white, uneven and low to the ground. He didn't react immediately, just kept moving, finishing what he was doing at pump 2. Only when he straightened did he look again. The patch was still there, closer than the night before, not by much, but enough to notice. Ethan didn't step forward this time, didn't close the distance. He leaned against the side of the building, arms loose at his sides, giving the moment space to settle on its own. The dog stood just outside the brighter circle of light, still, watching. Not the kind of watching that searched for weakness, something quieter, more deliberate, like it was measuring whether anything had changed. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. There was nothing to say. After a while, the dog shifted, not retreating, just lowering its head slightly. For a moment, Ethan thought it might step closer. Instead, it turned and disappeared again, swallowed by the soft, restless motion of snow and shadow. He didn't follow. Didn't expect anything. That should have been the end of it, but the next morning, something was waiting. Not in the exact same spot. A little to the left this time, near the edge of the step where the snow gathered unevenly. Ethan noticed it before he reached the door. A piece of fabric. Small, torn, but oddly clean against everything else. Not fresh, but not buried in dirt or ice either. He crouched, brushing away the thin layer of snow that had settled over it. The edges were frayed, but not randomly. It looked like it had been pulled from something larger, a sleeve maybe, or the lining of a jacket. He turned it over once. No markings, no obvious use, just a fragment. Ethan glanced up. Out toward the road, then toward the open stretch beyond the pumps. No movement, no sound but the wind. He stood there longer than necessary. The fabric in his hand felt lighter than it should have, like it didn't belong to anything anymore. After a moment, he stepped inside, placed it next to the glove. Not aligned, not arranged, just near it. Martha noticed again. She always did. "You starting a collection?" she asked, not looking at him this time, but at the counter. Ethan shook his head. "Just showed up." She stepped closer, setting down a stack of receipts before picking up the fabric, turned it once between her fingers. "Too clean," she said. "For what?" "For something that's been out here this long." She set it back down. Not exactly where it had been, but close. People don't usually leave things like that behind. Ethan didn't respond. Because that wasn't the part that felt strange. It wasn't the object. It was the placement, the intention. The day moved forward. The sky stayed low, the light never fully committing to brightness. By evening, the wind had picked up again, pushing thin sheets of snow across the ground in slow, steady motions. Ethan stepped outside near closing, more out of habit than need. The pumps were quiet, the highway nearly empty. He stood at the base of the steps this time, not leaning, not waiting. Just there. He didn't look toward the edge of the light immediately, gave it time, let the silence settle into something familiar. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze. Nothing. Just snow, just the low hum of distant wind. He stayed another minute, then another. Something in him resisted going back inside too quickly. Not urgency, not expectation, just a reluctance to break something that hadn't fully formed yet. He reached into his pocket, turning the lighter once between his fingers. The metal clicked softly. The sound carried farther than it should have in the cold. And for a brief moment, he had the thought, not fully formed, not even something he could explain, just a quiet, unexpected question. What if it doesn't come back because of me? The thought didn't belong to anything logical. It didn't make sense. And yet, it stayed. Long enough to shift something small but noticeable. He exhaled, slow, then stepped back inside. The third morning felt different before he even opened the door, not in a way he could name, just a subtle tension in the air. He paused at the threshold, hand resting lightly against the handle, then pushed it open. Cold air moved in immediately, sharp, clean. He stepped out, and there it was, closer this time, not at the edge of the step, on it, a key, small, metal, the surface dulled by rust, edges worn smooth. It didn't shine, didn't stand out, but it was placed carefully, not dropped, not lost, deliberate. Ethan crouched again, slower this time. His breath fogged faintly in front of him as he reached for it. The metal was cold, colder than the air. He turned it once. There was no tag, no number, no obvious connection to anything nearby, just a key, to something, somewhere, or maybe nothing at all. He straightened, the key resting in his palm, and for the first time, he didn't look out toward the road. He looked past it, toward the open stretch beyond the station, toward the place where the light ended. The dog was there, not fully visible, just enough, a shape against the shifting white, closer than before, still keeping its distance, still not crossing into the light, but not as far back as it had been. Ethan didn't move, didn't call out. He held the key loosely in his hand, and for a second, something shifted, not in the dog, in him. He didn't feel watched, not in the usual way. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a strange, quiet awareness, like something had noticed him and decided that was enough. The dog stood there a moment longer, then, as before, it turned and was gone. Inside, the three objects sat on the counter, the glove, the fabric, the key. They didn't make sense together, didn't form a pattern, didn't suggest anything useful. Still, Ethan didn't move them, didn't question them out loud. He just worked, but every now and then, his eyes drifted back to the door, not because he expected anything, not yet, but because something had started, and for the first time in a long while, he hadn't turned away from it. Ethan stepped outside before he needed to. The sky hadn't shifted yet, still carrying that flat gray light that sat somewhere between afternoon and evening. The wind had settled for once, leaving the air unusually still, like the land itself was holding its breath. He didn't check the pumps first, didn't bring a rag or tools with him. He just stood there, at the edge of the steps, not leaning against anything this time, not pretending to be busy, just present. It felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable exactly, but exposed, in a quiet way he couldn't quite name. For a while nothing happened. The highway remained distant, a faint hum behind layers of snow and silence. The ground stretched outward, empty except for the marks left by drifting wind. Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides. He didn't reach for the lighter, didn't give himself anything to do. That was new. Minutes passed. He didn't count them, didn't check the time. If anything, he let the moment expand without trying to define it. Waiting, he realized, wasn't something he was used to doing without purpose. In the past, waiting had always meant something was coming, an order, a signal, a decision that had already been made. This was different. There was no certainty attached to it, no outcome to prepare for, just the possibility that nothing would happen at all. And somehow, that didn't push him back inside. He noticed the dog before he saw it. A a shift in the stillness. Subtle, but enough. Ethan's gaze lifted, not sharply, not searching, just enough to meet the movement where it was. There. Farther out than yesterday, but not as far as before. The dog stood partially angled, its body turned just enough to suggest it could leave at any second if it chose to. It didn't step forward immediately, didn't move at all at first, as if the distance itself was part of the decision. Ethan didn't close it. He stayed where he was, not offering anything, not asking. The dog began to move, slow, measured, each step placed with care, leaving faint impressions in the thin layer of snow. It didn't approach directly. Instead, it angled slightly, circling the outer edge of the light rather than walking straight into it, a path that kept options open. Ethan noticed that, the way it avoided committing too early, the way it never fully turned its back. When it finally reached a point near the bottom of the steps, it stopped, closer than before, but still outside reach. There was something in its mouth, small, flat. Ethan waited. The dog lowered its head, not abruptly, not like it was dropping something it didn't want, more like placing something where it had already decided it should go. A thin piece of paper fell against the snow. The dog stepped back immediately after, not far, but enough. It held its ground, watching. Ethan didn't move right away. He let the moment sit, not out of caution, but out of something closer to respect. Then, slowly, he stepped down. The snow crunched beneath his boots, louder than it should have been in the quiet. The dog didn't retreat further, didn't advance either. It simply adjusted its stance, weight shifting forward slightly. Ethan crouched, picking up the object. A ticket. Old. Edges softened, the print faded enough that he had to turn it toward the light to read anything. Some kind of transit stub, maybe. A bus line. The name barely legible. It didn't matter. What mattered was the same thing as before. It had been placed, not lost. Ethan stayed crouched for a moment longer than necessary, the ticket resting between his fingers. He didn't look at the dog immediately, didn't meet its gaze. Instead, he let his attention drift outward toward the open stretch beyond the station. Then, quietly, he stood and did something he hadn't planned. He turned and walked back inside. No hesitation, no second glance, just a simple movement as if it had already been decided. The door shut behind him with a soft click. Inside, the warmth felt heavier than before, more noticeable. Ethan moved to the small shelf behind the counter. He opened a can without thinking too much about it. Something simple, something soft. Soup, maybe. He poured it into a shallow bowl, added a little water, then stood there for a second, looking down at it. This wasn't part of any routine. There was no rule for this, no right way to do it. That uncertainty should have stopped him. It didn't. He stepped back outside. The dog was still there, exactly where it had been, as if it had expected him to return. Ethan walked a few steps forward this time, not all the way, just enough to change the distance. Then he bent down and placed the bowl on the ground, not too close, not too far. He didn't look at the dog as he did it, didn't make a sound. Then he stepped back, same number of steps, same distance he had given before. The dog didn't move, not immediately. It stayed where it was, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the bowl, then on Ethan, then back to the bowl. The space between those 2 points seemed to stretch. Time moved differently inside it. Ethan remained still. He didn't shift his weight, didn't cross his arms, didn't try to make himself smaller or less threatening. He just stayed. The wind stirred faintly again, brushing across the surface of the snow. The sound was soft, but enough to break the stillness. The dog took a step forward, paused, another step, then stopped again. Each movement was followed by stillness, each advance measured against the possibility of retreat. Ethan watched without focusing too hard, letting his gaze stay loose, unfixed. It felt important somehow, not to lock onto it, not to make it feel seen in a way that demanded something. Eventually, the dog reached the bowl. It didn't rush, didn't lower its head immediately. Instead, it stood there. Close enough now that Ethan could see the details more clearly, the uneven line of its coat, the slight bend in one ear, the way its ribs showed faintly beneath the fur, not extreme but enough to tell a story. The dog lowered its head, sniffed once, then lifted it again, looking back at Ethan, waiting. Something shifted then, not in the dog, in Ethan. He realized, without fully understanding why, that this wasn't about the food. Not really. The bowl was just part of it, a piece, but not the point. The point was whether he would stay where he was, whether he would let this happen without trying to control it, without stepping in too soon. He stayed. The dog lowered its head again. This time, it didn't stop. It began to eat. Not frantically. Not like something desperate, but quickly enough to suggest it didn't expect the opportunity to last. Ethan watched. Not closely, just enough to remain present. The sound was small, barely noticeable, but it filled the space between them in a way that nothing else had. When the bowl was empty, the dog stepped back, same as before, creating distance again, not leaving, just resetting the space. Ethan didn't move forward, didn't reach for the bowl, didn't try to close the gap. He let the distance exist, the same way it had before, only now it felt different, not empty, defined. After a moment, the dog turned, its body angled toward the open snow beyond the station. It paused once, not looking back, not exactly, but not fully gone either. Then it moved and disappeared into the pale stretch of white. Ethan waited, not because he expected it to return, but because leaving too quickly felt wrong. After a while, he stepped forward and picked up the empty bowl. The metal felt colder now. He carried it inside, setting it next to the others, the glove, the fabric, the key. And now, something else had been added, not physically, but in a way that didn't need to be named. Later that night, Martha glanced at the counter, then at the bowl, then at Ethan. "You feeding something out there?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a cloth and set it down. "Yeah," he said. She nodded once, didn't ask what, didn't ask why, just said, "Don't leave it too close to the door. Coyotes get bold when they think something's easy." Ethan gave a small nod. He knew she wasn't talking about coyotes. The rest of the night passed without anything unusual. Cars came, cars went. The highway kept moving. But something had changed, not in the world, not in the station, in him. The next morning when he stepped outside, he didn't look at the ground first. He looked out, toward the place where the snow met the edge of the light. The pattern didn't form all at once. It settled in slowly, the way routines do when no one names them. Ethan stopped questioning whether the dog would come. Instead, he adjusted his day around the possibility that it might. Not in obvious ways. He still checked the pumps, still wiped the glass doors, still moved through the station with the same quiet efficiency. But there were small changes. He finished certain tasks earlier than necessary, left others for later, not because it mattered when they were done, but because something else had begun to take up space in between. The dog never arrived at the same time twice. That became clear quickly. Some days it came while the light was still thin and gray, other times closer to evening when the station's glow stretched longer across the snow. Once, it didn't appear until nearly closing. Ethan had almost gone back inside when he caught the movement. Not at the edge of the light this time. Closer, standing just beyond the pumps. Still careful, still deliberate. It always brought something. That part never changed. But what it brought, that was where the pattern began to shift. A length of frayed cord knotted at one end, a flattened bottle cap, edges bent inward, a piece of plastic brittle with age. None of it was useful, none of it held value, yet each one was placed the same way, set down, not dropped, positioned, not discarded. Ethan stopped lining them up on the counter. At some point, he couldn't say when, he moved them to the small table in the back room, not hidden, but separate, a space that wasn't part of the station's routine. They began to gather there. Not arranged, not organized, just present. One afternoon, a truck pulled in just before the light began to fade. The engine idled longer than usual before shutting off. The driver stepped out slowly, stretching his back as if the motion itself required effort. Ray Dalton had been coming through for years. Ethan recognized the truck before he recognized the man. Long-haul rigs carried a certain wear to them, the kind that came from miles, not time. Ray matched it. Tall, broad through the shoulders, his posture slightly curved forward from years behind the wheel. His beard had gone mostly gray, though his eyes still held a sharpness that suggested he missed very little. He pushed the door open with the ease of someone who didn't need to look. "Cold enough for you?" he said, voice rough but not unfriendly. Ethan gave a small nod. "Gets worse." Ray huffed a quiet laugh. "Always does." He moved toward the counter, setting down a thermos and a folded bill without checking the amount. Ethan rang it up without speaking. That was how most of their exchanges went. Short, direct. But Ray lingered this time, not at the counter. His attention had shifted past it, toward the back, toward the table. "What's that?" Ray asked, nodding slightly. Ethan followed his gaze. The objects sat where he had left them, unchanged. "Nothing," Ethan said. Ray stepped closer anyway, picked up the bottle cap between his fingers, turned it once. "Don't look like nothing." Ethan didn't respond. Ray set it down, but not exactly where it had been. His eyes moved across the rest of the items, the glove, the fabric, the key, the cord. He didn't touch those. "Seen stuff like this before," he said after a moment. Ethan glanced at him. "Out here," Ray added, gesturing vaguely toward the road. "People stop, lose things, leave things behind, without thinking." Ethan leaned back slightly against the counter. "That's not new." "No," Ray agreed. "But someone picking it up and bringing it back?" He shook his head once. "That's different." The words didn't land immediately. Ethan let them sit. Ray poured himself a cup from the thermos, the steam rising faintly in the cooler air. "There used to be a place up the road," he said, almost as an afterthought. Ethan didn't ask. Ray continued anyway. "Old stop, before this one. Not much. Just a few pumps, a diner that stayed open too late." He took a sip. "Closed down after a wreck. Bad one." Ethan's posture shifted slightly, not enough to show interest, but enough to listen. "People didn't come back after that," Ray said. "Place just stayed there for a while. Then not even that." He set the cup down. "Things get left behind in places like that, more than you'd think." Ethan glanced again at the table, at the objects. They didn't look connected, didn't form a story. And yet, Ray's words pressed against something he hadn't fully considered. Later that evening, after Ray had gone and the station returned to its usual quiet, Ethan stepped into the back room. The table felt different now, not heavier, just more defined. He picked up the key, turned it slowly, then set it back down, next to the fabric, then the glove, not arranging, just placing. The dog arrived while he was still inside. He didn't see it at first. He heard it, a faint shift against the outer wall. Not a scratch, not a knock, just enough to register. Ethan stepped back out. The air had grown colder, the light stretched thinner. The dog stood near the steps again, closer than it had been earlier in the week. There was no object this time, at least, not at first glance. Ethan stayed where he was, waiting. The dog moved forward, not toward him, toward the spot where it usually placed things. It lowered its head briefly, then stepped back. Ethan looked down. A piece of cloth, different from the one before, darker. He crouched, picking it up. It wasn't torn the same way. This one had an edge that looked worn, handled, used. He turned it once, and for a second, something shifted, not in the object, in the recognition. He stood slowly, looked at the dog, not directly, but enough. "You getting these from somewhere?" he said quietly. The words didn't expect an answer. The dog didn't react, but it didn't leave either. Ethan didn't go inside right away. He stayed, the object still in his hand, the space between them no longer empty, just unfilled. When he finally stepped back inside, he didn't place the cloth on the table immediately. He held it a moment longer, then set it down, not next to the others, slightly apart. That night, he didn't turn off the light as soon as he usually did. He sat at the edge of the bed, the room dim but not dark. The objects rested on the table across from him. No order, no explanation. And yet, they didn't feel random anymore, not completely. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands against his knees. For a long time, he just looked at them, not trying to solve anything, not trying to connect them, just acknowledging that they were there. The silence didn't feel the same. It wasn't filled, but it wasn't hollow either. There was a difference, subtle, but real. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan didn't reach for the lighter, didn't need something to occupy his hands. He just sat there, letting the room be what it was, letting the presence of those small, forgotten things exist without pushing them away. Outside, the highway carried on. Vehicles passed through the night, their lights cutting briefly across the snow before vanishing again. The world kept moving, unchanged, but inside the station, something had begun to gather. Not noise, not meaning. Something quieter, something that didn't need to be explained, and for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan didn't feel like the only thing in the room that had been left behind. It happened faster than Ethan expected, which was strange, because nothing about the past few days had moved quickly. Everything had been measured, spaced, built on distance and quiet, until it wasn't. That afternoon didn't feel different at first. The same dull sky, the same steady cold pressing in from all sides. Ethan worked through his routine without thinking much about it. Checked the fuel levels, cleared ice from the pump handles, tightened a loose panel on the side of the building. But something in him had already shifted, not outwardly. Nothing anyone passing through would notice. But underneath the surface, there was a growing sense that he understood something now, that the pattern wasn't random, that the distance had rules, and that maybe he knew how to move within them. The dog arrived earlier than usual. Ethan noticed it immediately this time, not because he was watching, but because he had stopped pretending he wasn't. It stood near the edge of the pumps, just outside the brightest part of the light, closer than before. The space between them had shortened almost without him realizing it. There was something in its mouth, a small shape, hard to make out from where he stood. Ethan wiped his hand slowly against his jacket, watched as the dog stepped forward, measured, careful, the same way it always had. It reached the base of the steps, lowered its head, placed the object down, and stepped back. Ethan didn't wait this time. That was the difference. He stepped forward, one step, then another, not fast, not abrupt, but sooner than he ever had before. The dog reacted instantly, not with panic, not with fear, but with something sharper. It pulled back, not far, but enough. Its body tightened slightly, weight shifting backward. Ready. Ethan stopped. But it was already too late. The distance had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Not immediately. He crouched, slower now, picking up the object. A piece of leather, worn, cracked at the edges, something that had once been part of something larger, a strap maybe. He turned it once in his hand, then looked up. The dog was farther back now, not at the edge of the light, beyond it, still watching, but not the same way. Ethan stood. He didn't step forward again, didn't call out, didn't reach for anything. He just stayed where he was. But the moment had already shifted, and they both knew it. The dog turned. No hesitation this time, no pause, just a clean, deliberate movement away from the light, into the snow. Gone. Ethan remained at the bottom of the steps longer than he should have, the piece of leather still in his hand. The air felt colder, sharper, not because the temperature had changed, but because something else had. He went back inside without thinking much about it, set the object on the table with the others. But this time, it didn't settle the same way. The room felt off, not empty, not quiet, just wrong. That night, the dog didn't come back. Ethan didn't expect it to. That part at least made sense. Still, he found himself stepping outside once more before closing, standing near the edge of the steps, not waiting, just checking, nothing. The next morning, there was no object. Ethan paused at the door longer than usual, looked down, then out, then back again, as if something might appear if he waited long enough. It didn't. The second day was the same. No movement at the edge of the light, no shift in the snow, no quiet presence holding the distance. Ethan worked. He didn't change his routine, didn't stand outside longer than necessary, didn't bring anything with him when he stepped out. But something had settled in, not a thought, not something he could put into words, just a quiet understanding. He had moved too soon. It wasn't about the step itself, not exactly. It was what the step meant, the assumption, the belief that he could close the distance on his own terms. That wasn't how it had worked, not from the beginning. Martha noticed before he said anything. She always did. It wasn't in what he did. It was in what he didn't. The way his eyes didn't drift toward the door as often, the way he stopped pausing between tasks. "You lose something?" she asked one afternoon, her voice casual but deliberate. Ethan shook his head. "No." She leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. "Doesn't look like no." Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached for a cloth, wiped down a section of the counter that didn't need it, then stopped. "There was a dog," he said. Martha nodded once. "Yeah, seen it." Ethan glanced at her. "You have?" "Comes around sometimes, stays out of reach." She shrugged slightly. "Smart animal." Ethan leaned back against the counter, his arms resting loosely at his sides. It was bringing things, he said. Martha didn't look surprised. Out here things get picked up, she said. Carried around. Wind moves them. Animals do too. Ethan shook his head. Not like this. She studied him for a moment, not questioning, just considering. What did you do? She asked. The question sat there, simple, direct. Ethan didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because saying it would make it clearer, more real. I stepped in, he said finally. Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened slightly. Too close? She asked. Ethan nodded once. She pushed herself off the counter, walking toward the door before stopping beside it. Things like that, she said, her voice quieter now. They don't stay where they feel cornered. Ethan didn't move, didn't respond. She rested her hand briefly against the doorframe, not looking at him now, looking out. Sometimes, she added, the only way they keep coming back is if you don't give them a reason to stop. Ethan stood there after she stepped outside. The words didn't feel like advice. Not exactly, more like something already known, just said out loud. That night, he didn't step outside before closing. Didn't check the edge of the light, didn't look for movement in the snow. But he didn't move the objects either. They stayed on the table, unchanged, unanswered. For the first time since it had started, the pattern had broken. And in the quiet that followed, Ethan realized something he hadn't expected. It wasn't confusion he felt, or frustration. It was loss. Not large, not overwhelming, but specific. Precise. The kind that comes from something small, something you hadn't realized you were holding on to. He sat on the edge of the bed that night, the room dim and still. The objects across from him, the space between them unchanged. But something had shifted. Not outside, inside. He didn't reach for the lighter, didn't try to distract himself. He just sat there, letting the silence settle, letting the absence stay. And for the first time, it didn't feel like the world had moved on without him. It felt like something had stopped coming back. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It built itself over hours, wind first, low and restless, brushing across the open ground in uneven bursts. Then the sky darkened, not with clouds alone, but with something heavier, something that pressed downward and stayed. By evening, the first real snow began to fall. Not the light drifting kind from earlier days. This was dense, relentless, the kind that didn't settle quietly, but erased whatever it touched. Inside the station, the lights flickered, once, then again. Ethan noticed immediately, not because it was unusual, but because the rhythm was wrong. The building had its own sounds, its own patterns. He knew them without thinking. This didn't belong to any of them. He moved toward the breaker panel along the back wall, running a hand along the surface before opening it. Everything looked intact, no loose connections, no visible faults. Still, the lights flickered again, longer this time, the hum of electricity shifting just slightly out of sync. Ethan stepped back, closing the panel. Then he turned toward the front door. The wind had picked up. Snow swept past the windows in thick diagonal lines, blurring the view beyond the glass. The edge of the light outside, the place he had been watching for days, was nearly gone now, swallowed. He pulled on his gloves and stepped outside. The cold hit harder than before, sharper, immediate. The wind pressed against him, forcing each step to carry weight. He moved toward the side of the building, checking the external connections, the line that fed power from the pole beyond the lot. The snow reached his boots now, gathering faster than it could settle. Visibility dropped with each passing minute. He adjusted a loose cable, tightening it with numb fingers. The lights inside steadied for a moment, then flickered again. Ethan straightened, exhaling slowly. This wasn't something he could fix completely, not in this weather, not without shutting everything down. He turned back toward the building, and that was when he saw it. At the edge of the storm, not at the edge of the light, because there was no edge anymore. Just a faint, diffused glow fighting against the snow. The dog stood there, still, no object in its mouth, no movement beyond the subtle shift of its body against the wind. Ethan didn't react the way he had before. He didn't step forward, didn't call out, didn't try to bridge the distance. He just stood there, letting the moment exist without interference. The dog didn't come closer, didn't retreat. It simply remained. The wind surged again, stronger now, pushing snow across the ground in uneven waves. Ethan turned back toward the station. The lights flickered once more. He had to go inside, but something held him there for a second longer. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, something quieter. Then he stepped inside and shut the door. The warmth returned slowly, not enough to push out the cold entirely, but enough to dull its edge. Ethan removed his gloves, flexing his fingers once. Then he looked toward the table in the back room. The objects sat where they had been, unchanged, waiting. He stood there for a moment, then moved, not quickly, not with urgency, but with something that felt deliberate. He picked up the glove first, carried it to the front, set it down just outside the door, then the fabric, the key, the cord, the bottle cap, each one placed on the ground, not arranged, not aligned, just set down where they landed. When he was done, he stepped back, closed the door halfway, not fully shut, not fully open. The wind carried snow into the small gap, a thin line of white forming along the floor. Ethan didn't stop it. He stepped away, gave the space back. Time passed. He didn't measure it, didn't check the clock, didn't sit down. He stayed near the counter, far enough from the door, close enough to hear anything that changed. At first there was nothing, just the wind, the low hum of electricity still trying to hold steady, the soft scrape of snow moving across the ground. Then, something else. Not a sound. Not exactly. More like a shift. A presence entering the space where there hadn't been one before. Ethan didn't turn immediately, didn't rush. When he finally looked, the dog was there, not outside the light, not at the edge of the steps, closer, standing just beyond the threshold, inside the reach of the dim glow spilling from the doorway. Its coat was dusted with snow, small flakes clinging to the dark fur along its back. The wind pushed against it, but it didn't move. Ethan stayed where he was. The dog lowered its head slightly, not toward him, toward the ground. One step forward, then another, slow, measured. It reached the first object, the glove. It paused, touched it lightly with its nose, not picking it up, not moving it, just acknowledging it. Then it moved to the next, the fabric, the key, each one, the same way. Ethan watched, not closely, not intently. He let his gaze stay soft, unfixed. The dog reached the last object, stopped, then it lifted its head. For a moment, there was nothing between them, no distance that needed to be measured, no movement that needed to be anticipated, just the space, and the fact that neither of them was trying to control it. The dog stepped forward again, closer than it had ever been. Ethan didn't move, didn't adjust his stance, didn't even shift his weight. The dog stopped, within reach. It didn't lower its head, didn't search for food, didn't look for anything to take. It simply stood there. And then, very lightly, it leaned forward. Its head brushed against Ethan's hand, just once, not pressing, not lingering. Then it stepped back. The moment didn't stretch, didn't build into anything larger. It ended the same way it began, quietly. The dog turned, walked back into the storm. Gone again, Ethan remained where he was, his hand still where it had been, not raised, not lowered. He didn't follow, didn't call out. He just stood there. The wind continued. The lights flickered once more, but something had changed, not outside, not in the storm, inside the space between them. Ethan stepped forward after a while, closed the door fully this time. The line of snow on the floor remained. He didn't clean it. The objects were still outside, scattered, half covered already. He left them there. That night, the storm didn't stop. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was waiting for something to return. Something had already come close enough. The storm didn't end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, like something reluctant to leave. By morning, the wind had settled into something quieter. The sky remained overcast, but the heaviness had lifted just enough for the world to feel visible again. Snow covered everything, clean, unbroken, except for the places where something had moved through it. Ethan opened the door without thinking about it. The cold entered first, softer than before. Then the stillness. Vargo was already there, not at the edge of the light, not watching from a distance, on the steps. Curled slightly against the door, its body angled in a way that suggested it had been there for a while. Not waiting in the way it used to, not measuring distance, just present. Ethan didn't stop in the doorway, didn't hesitate. He stepped out, letting the door swing open behind him. The dog lifted its head, ears shifting slightly, but it didn't move away. That was new. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking down, taking in the details he hadn't been able to see before. The uneven line of Vargo's coat, the way the darker fur along its back blended into the lighter patches that had dulled over time. The faint scar near its shoulder, barely visible beneath the snow that had gathered there. "Morning," Ethan said quietly. The word didn't expect an answer, but it stayed in the air anyway. Vargo blinked once, then lowered its head again, not retreating, not reacting, just acknowledging. Ethan stepped past it, moving down the steps. He didn't look back right away, didn't check if it followed. He walked toward the pumps, brushing snow from the handles with slow, steady movements. The work felt the same, the motions unchanged, but something in the rhythm had shifted. After a few seconds, he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of distance. He glanced over his shoulder. Vargo had moved, not close, but closer than before, standing near the base of the steps now, watching. Ethan turned back to his work, didn't call it over, didn't make space for it deliberately. The space adjusted on its own. That was how the next few days unfolded, not as a clear change, not as a defined moment, but as a series of small shifts that didn't need to be announced. Vargo stayed longer, at first just through the morning, then into the afternoon, then one night when Ethan stepped outside before closing, it was still there. He didn't react, didn't mark it as something important, just moved through his routine, locked the door, turned off the lights. When he came back out the next morning, it was still there. Not waiting, not leaving, staying. Ethan didn't question it, didn't try to understand why. That part didn't matter. He found an old metal bowl in the storage room, washed it, set it near the door, not too close, not hidden. Vargo used it, not immediately, but without hesitation. The pattern changed, not the one that had existed before. That one was gone. This was something else. No more objects placed at the edge of the steps, no more distance measured in careful increments. Instead, presence. Vargo moved through the space around the station with quiet certainty, never wandering too far, never settling too close. It didn't follow Ethan everywhere, didn't stay at his side, but it was always within sight, or just beyond it. That mattered more. One afternoon, Ray pulled in again. The truck's engine idled before cutting off, the sound echoing briefly against the stillness. He stepped out, the same way he always did, slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of miles without showing it. But this time, he paused, right outside the door. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Ethan didn't look up immediately. "Something wrong?" he asked. Ray pushed the door open, stepping inside with a small shake of his head. "Didn't think it would stick around," he said. Ethan glanced toward the window. Vargo stood just outside, not looking in, just standing. "Didn't either," Ethan said. Ray set his thermos down, eyes still flicking back toward the door. "Animals like that, they don't usually pick a place," he said. "Not unless they've got a reason." Ethan didn't respond, because that part, he didn't need explained. Ray studied him for a second longer, then nodded once. "Guess you gave it one," he said. Ethan didn't correct him, didn't agree either, because it didn't feel like something he had given. It felt like something that had been allowed. Later that night, after Ray had gone and the station had quieted again, Ethan stepped outside. The air had cleared. The sky opened just enough to reveal faint stars beyond the drifting clouds. Vargo lay near the steps. Not asleep, just resting. Ethan stood beside it, not touching, not calling. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan sat down on the top step, slowly, carefully. The distance between them closed, not all at once, not deliberately, just enough. Vargo didn't shift away, didn't move closer either. It remained where it was. That was enough. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his arms against his knees. He looked out toward the highway. A car passed in the distance, then another, headlights cutting through the dark before fading into nothing. The world moved, unchanged. For the first time, he didn't feel separate from it, not because anything had changed out there, but because something had changed here, the space beside him, the presence that stayed, the absence of something needing to be proven. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible for a moment before disappearing into the cold air. Vargo shifted slightly, not toward him, not away, just adjusting. Ethan didn't react, didn't look down. He didn't need to. Morning came quietly the next day. Snow fell again, but softer this time, lighter. Ethan opened the door. Vargo was there, not waiting, not watching, just there. Ethan stepped out, looked at the highway. Cars passed, same as always. He watched them for a moment, then looked back. Vargo hadn't moved, and for the first time since he had arrived here, Ethan didn't feel like he was standing in a place meant only for people passing through. He wasn't waiting for something to happen, wasn't holding himself outside of the moment. He was in it, and that was enough. Sometimes, the things that change us the most don't arrive loudly or all at once. They come quietly, in small, repeated moments we almost ignore. Ethan didn't become a different man overnight. He didn't win anything, fix everything, or find some grand purpose. He simply stopped turning away. And in doing so, he made space for trust, for presence, for something that chose to stay. Maybe in your life, there's something small like that too. A moment, a person, a quiet opportunity to show up instead of step back. Don't overlook it, because sometimes what feels insignificant is actually where everything begins again. If this story meant something to you, share where you're watching from or what part stayed with you. And if you'd like more stories like this, you're always welcome to stay. May you find peace in the quiet moments, and may you never miss the small things that are trying to find their way to you.